The idea of this talk is to tell you that the debate in economic analysis was won by the Austrians, but that from my point of view, they still have not found out. So basically, what I'm going to do is a review of what the debate was prior to Keynes' general theory. For now, I keep composing. With the course of the minutes, it is likely I will say what I think. Everyone knows what it means when I say these things. For this, the logic is to understand Keynes' work compared to what was the analytical framework prior to the general theory. And this is what later allows us to understand the Friedman's work and how Friedman is the one who built the Austrian triumph. So basically, what we have to understand is how the world worked prior to the general theory. So basically, both the Austrian school and the school in Stockholm and Cambridge, England, are the heirs of Bissell. That is to say, everyone works with the idea of the investment savings schemes where everyone knows them well. So basically, what is a person who saves? He is a person who has more money than ideas. And an investor is a guy who has more ideas than money. So that mechanism is coordinated through interest rates. What we also have to understand is that the interest rate is neither more nor less than a consequence of relative prices, which are today's prices in terms of tomorrow's prices. That is why if tomorrow's prices went down, the interest rate would be higher. Therefore, we would consume less today, we would consume more tomorrow. And now they have that going function of savings in terms of interest rate. And under that idea, also, the one who was willing to sell goods would be willing, if tomorrow's prices are higher than today's, to sell tomorrow. So when the interest rate falls, the investment increases. That is, it is very important to understand this and how, let's say, relative prices in an intertemporal context have implicit interest rates. And that basically what these three schools discuss are the financial counterpart with respect to that natural interest rate and the type of problems it can generate. In that sense, the Swedes were concerned with the theory of loan funds, where basically the competition in the banking sector. What they did was induce them to lower the interest rate in such a way that an excess of demand was generated in the goods market. Because the interest rate was below the natural one and an excess of supply was generated in the money market, and consequently that generated inflation. As far as what has to do with the Cambridge School, where Robertson is, and Keynes' theory that is destroyed by Hayek. I mean, the idea was that the mirror market was the bonus market. So, in the face of a situation of pessimism in that they were sold, the prices of the bonuses were too low, the interest rate that was above the level of intertemporal coordination. An excess of supply was generated in the goods market and therefore an excess of demand in the money market that induced deflation. And the reality is that that view of Keynes was not so bad either, because what Keynes postulated was, if in rigor people offer work inelastically, the prices could be null and still persist the excess of supply in the labor market. We have to understand it in the logic of the moment in which it was written, that is, the logic, and what worried Cambridge School was basically the problem of deflation and unemployment. And on the other hand, we have the Austrian school with the theory of the boom-bust of Mises, where basically Mises focused on monetary policy. That is because already at that time central banks were doing monetary policy to control the interest rate. And Caesar emphasizes the situation of a central bank trying to inflate the economy, putting the interest rate below the level of equilibrium, generating in excess a demand, where that also creates a situation of consumption and investment simultaneously, making the economy operate above its possibilities by generating a monetary wedge. And what happens when prices start to rise? The real value of money begins to fall, and then the businessmen discover that those investments were incorrect. That is, consumers cannot sustain that level of consumption. Why? Because the economy was crumbling, and that is what then generates the boom. And in the middle, the capital structure is damaged, and that is where the hate triangles appear to explain this story in a much more complete way. And in fact, the Austrian approach was so good that it was the one that dominated the scene until the Great Depression happened. The interesting point is that one has to understand who Keynes was. Keynes was part of the political corruption. Keynes wrote a book that was a pamphlet, that was a garbage of a book that was dedicated to corrupt and messianic politicians. And I really like the quote that has that as on point: everything that is good in this book is copied, and everything that is new is bad. That is, the book is truly frightening from the point of view of the quality of the economic analysis, but from the point of view of Keynes' strategy, it is brilliant. What does Keynes do? It has happened to me to have to listen and say, no, it is a book that is badly written. Actually, quite the opposite. It is very well written. It is a work of art. Basically, what Keynes does is hit on each one of the vital aspects of the previous analytical framework. Look, we are talking about a world where, in the market of goods, with an intertemporal coordination mechanism, the interest rate is determined, and in the money market, the price level is determined. In fact, when you have a mechanism by which, I don't know, I increase the amount of money, I influence the interest rate, I generate an excessive demand in the goods market, I have an excessive supply in the money market, which makes the prices go up. So what does Keynes do? He destroys that analytical framework. It destroys it. The first blow of Keynes' destruction is about saving. What he does is create a consumption function that has several interesting components. The first is that Keynes, in all his life, only took a single economy course, which he took with Marshall. And Marshall, basically what he did was partial equilibrium. So Keynes, as a faithful heir of Marshall, designs a consumption function in the form of partial equilibrium. And that allows him to put the current income into function. By being able to put the current income and put it as a constant fraction, let's call it a marginal consumption, the average profit. This has several issues. The first is that saving becomes a residue and the intertemporality in the function of saving is destroyed. The interest rate disappears. And as if all this were not enough, that construction allows him, in mathematical terms, to derive the multiplier and with it the adjustment of quantities. A crucial element to modifying the level of the productium with management of the aggregate demand and with impacts on the level of employment. Basically what the politicians wanted to hear. So there he destroys the first element of the goods market, where saving is disconnected from the interest rate, and instead of being something intertemporal, it is a residue that arises between income and consumption. The second phenomenal element is a function of investment. When you take the first chapter, which is the 11th, it is formidable. The description of the theory of investment is formidable. Now in chapter 2, everything is destroyed. And he ends up saying that investment is basically guided by a lyrical testicular issue, so to speak. Something like that they invest if the balls are sung. In other words, what is the idea of animal spirits? I apologize for the technical vocabulary. What does this mean? Well, what matters to me is that it is understood. What this means is that investment is now exogenous, it stopped depending on the interest rate. So investment does not depend on the interest rate, saving does not depend on the interest rate. Now in the goods market, everything can be determined except the interest rate. So what that does is not only break the intertemporality and destroy the macroeconomics of capital, and turn it into the macroeconomics of work. Why? Because now the only thing that can be determined with investment is the GDP. And from there the miracle of the multiplication of the bread appears. Because what is Keynes going to advise politicians after this? Look, with public spending is the continuity of the arm of God. By increasing public spending can generate all the GDP you want. It is the miracle of the multiplication of the bread. Damn the pizza producers who make them so small. So that is what happens in the logic of the Keynes goods market. It is written for politicians. That is to say, the virtue is saving, now the virtue is spending. The more waste, the better. Happy politicians. That is the first point. Now the level of income is determined in the goods market, with adjustments in quantity, with $1,000 in the multiplication of the breads. Fantastic. Let's go. Everything would be great if it was not because it is a waste and that it was wrong. But let's go to the second point. The second point is the money market. In the money market, what you determine, as in any good, is the purchasing power of that good. That is, if I have an economy of pears and bananas and I increase the amount of bananas, the purchasing power of the bananas in terms of pears falls. I need more bananas to buy the same amount of pears. With the same amount of pears, with the money, the same thing happens. This was explained in Mises in the theory of credit. A book that was given to Keynes to translate the proposal for it to be translated into English. Mr. Keynes said that this book was bad and that it had to be translated. But the worst of all is that Mr. Keynes did not know German. So, what did Keynes do? He thought of determining the interest rate in the money market. That is, he used the mere market to determine the interest rate. And with that, what did he derive? He destroyed the theory of capital, because now the interest rate is the price of money. What is the price of money? The price of money is its purchasing power, what you can buy with it. Like the interest rate. That is a truly imbecile thing. But what did he do with this? He went on to determine the income in the goods markets and the interest rate in the monetary market. So, what did he need now? He needed to determine the price level. And what did he do? He adopted the labor theory of value. When you go to chapter 21 of this fucking book, what it says is that the prices are determined from the costs. That is an offense against the beginning of Menges imputation. That is tremendously violent. And we suffer from that. We suffer from our policymakers when they say, "Do you remember that lady?" And the businessmen raise her on a stick. Let's say the workers are very ambitious. Guys, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. When you issue any good that increases above its demand, its relative price, its purchasing power falls. What does this mean? That when I issue money, the purchasing power of the money is going to fall. Therefore, I am going to have a rise in prices. And if I do it continuously, I am going to have inflation. Faced with this situation, Milton Friedman appears. The interesting thing about Milton Friedman is that, while the Austrians remained arguing in the Tower of Mafel, because it was a disgusting book, it was a pamphlet and it was not worth discussing, they took everything and put the politicians in it. What did Friedman do? Friedman sank in the Keynesian mud and fought in the Keynesian mud. That is different. What you have to understand is that there are three Milton Friedmans. There is a Friedman of academia. There is a Friedman of the dissemination of status quo books. Free to choose, capitalism and freedom, the free series to choose. And there is a Friedman who is the best of all, who is the Friedman of conferences. The Friedman of conferences combines the rigorousness of the academic Friedman, the capacity of dissemination of the free-to-choose Friedman, but above all, he is a superlative Friedman, very above these two together. Because when you read books like Dollars and Deficits, The Monetarist Economy, The Damages of Money, any of those books, or the one of Development, Money and Development, I can assure you that Friedman is much closer to Mises than you imagine. If not, take the Mises conferences in Argentina and compare with what Friedman says. What happens is that there is a Friedman who is the Friedman who fights in the academia, in the Keynesian mud. And that is where his contributions come from. His first great contribution is on the epistemological question. Basically, to tell the Keynesians, first the data. That is, first what I'm going to do is run with the data. And with that, you are hitting it everywhere. The second great contribution has to do with the theory of consumption. That is, it develops the theory of permanent income. It sets up an intertemporal consumption function. It recoups the interest rate and eliminates what? The multiplier. The miracle of the multiplication of the bread is over. The other contribution, where it comes from the middle of the 20th century, the inflation rate accelerates. The Keynesians do not have an answer for this. It formulates the quantitative theory as a function of money demand. It shows that this function is stable. Therefore, being that stable function, if I emit above the demand of money, I generate inflation. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. The other blow that gives them is the blow that gives them, together with Anna Schwartz. In the Monetary History of the United States, Chapter 7, the Great Contraction of 1929 to 1933, where basically what it shows is that the investment, the Keynesians have a problem of nominal illusion. Having that problem of nominal illusion, they did not realize that even when the rate was zero, in real terms, it was huge, because there it shows that the investment depends strongly on the real interest rate. And on the other hand, the fanciful rigid achieved the low prices, which the Keynesians said were inflexible, shows that precisely that was not what happened in the Great Depression. That is, that prices had been strongly contracted, at the rate that was contracted with the amount of money, with which, in that aspect, the Keynesians had achieved that the fiscal policy was fully effective, not the Keynesians but Keynes, and that monetary policy was of no use. Where the difference between Keynesians and Keynesians is that Keynesians believed in monetary policy, and as an extreme case they used the trap of liquidity. Friedman recoups the power of monetary policy, saying that monetary policy is important. And what explains the Great Depression is monetary policy. And if it were not for the central bank, that is, the Fed, thanks for the gift, who did it, I thank you infinitely, recoups the idea of the power of monetary policy. So Friedman knocked them at the Keynesians, and the Keynesians escape with the Phillips curve, that negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. And Friedman chewed on this idea for years. You see conferences of the 1860s, 1961, 1963, and he looked at it with the relationship between the prices and the variation in the amount of money, and he saw that if the money was neutral, let's say in terms of the academy, not in terms of what Friedman thought in the conferences, what he noticed was that there was a short trade-off. It had to disappear in the long run. And that is what he does with the Phillips curve, increased by inflation. And this is the first great triumph of the Austrian school. Because when Friedman does this test, he's forced to return to micro-fundaments. Because basically he develops a theory of the labor market, where he says, look, in the labor market, the real wage is determined if the expectations are adaptive. When the central bank modifies monetary policy, the businessmen will be feeling that the prices are higher. Then they believe that the real wage is falling, and they go out to hire more people. And of course, for that they have to pay more for the wages. Then the employees believe that they will have a higher real wage. Therefore, the economy goes out of balance and produces above the balance. It is the boom. But then what happens? The agents find out that in reality, what there was that there was more inflation, that there was not a relative price improvement, but that all prices were rising, and with which the boost comes. In other words, then the economy moves towards a level of employment similar to the shock. That is, it returns the unemployment rate to its natural level, but now with a higher inflation level. And this has basically finished in the year. This was in the year 1968. In the year 1972, Lucas ends up annihilating the Keynesians with his paper on rational expectations and empirically validates it in the year 1973. That is to say that what you see is that to finish debating the Keynesians, it was necessary to return to the micro-foundations. It was necessary to return to the Austrians. But not only that. The triumph had been given over a part of the economy. That is, it had been finished debating the work economy using the micro-foundations. So when once this problem of stabilization and all this was finished, the economy saw again what its real problem was, which is how we generate wealth, how we manage to grow. And then already in the 1978, and this counted by people who were Lucas students, Lucas was obsessed with the issue of growth. That is, the return of the intertemporality. When you today look at an academic paper from the mainstream, it is all micro-founded and intertemporal. That is, that the analytical framework that triumphed was the framework of the Austrians, the intertemporality and the micro-foundation. And in reality, this is the part that interests me about ways to highlight, is that the Austrian school should be an upgrade. That is because although today's literature has the essence of what the Austrian school was, in fact, what is most similar to it is the theory of real cycles, and if you put money in it, it comes out automatically. But apart from that, my vision is that the problem with the construction of the production function that is implicit in Austrian jobs, the growth cannot be explained. because the presence of constant performance at scale makes that inexorably at some point the process is exhausted. To say it in another way, I can grow so much, and as soon as I accumulate capital and work, now the growth of the population is basically exogenous. You grow at a rate of 1%. So what happens? I can accumulate capital. As long as I'm below the level of balance, I am going to show growth. This is the model of Salo. And what is the problem? There comes a time when the process is saturated and I am limited in my growth in what? In the growth rate of the population. So, and the structure. And that is also valid for the model. That is also known as the Rancy model, which still looks more like the Austrian concept. They all are. There is the intertemporal preference. Everything is there. Well, the Hague triangles are not there. But instead of having a good, they take two goods with different intensities and reproduce the result of the triangles. So, what was the problem with that literature? That literature, to be able to explain growth, needed to put the exogenous technological progress. And the truth is that, to explain growth, let's see, to give you an idea, the Salo model explains only 15% of growth. 85% is not explained. That is, I'm buying a structure where what explains growth comes determined by assumption. That is not a theory. And the economic theory advanced towards the models of endogenous growth, which obviously, where did they come from? From Chicago with Paul Roman and with Robert Lucas, where Robert Lucas is an heir of Hirofumi Izawa, who was the first to generate the endogenous growth model with human capital, although it was not called that at that time, because in Chicago in the 1960s, they worked with this idea of human capital as a result of the failure of the Salo test. And why the idea of human capital? Because they have the restriction of accumulating work. Why? Because they can educate themselves and consequently grow more. So the accumulation process is not exhausted. And that is what Raymer does, what Lucas does, and that is where the endogenous growth theory is born. Therefore, to close this, from my point of view, the Austrians won the debate. They returned to the micro foundations. They returned to the intertemporal. They rescued the Hague triangles in more complex structures. But to be able to move forward and get ahead, you have to be able to explain the growth and the reality. To be able to explain the growth again, what you have to do, despite the error of the work value theory, is to return to Adam Smith, with which, if the Austrians combined all their Brits' contribution that has been made, along with the endogenous growth theories, plus raising the principles of Adam Smith, surely the Austrian school would become the mainstream of the economics. That's all. Thank you.